The echo of her words still vibrated in the air, a sour note that had curdled the otherwise ordinary afternoon. Honestly, look at you. You're practically destitute. It wasn't just the insult, delivered with the casual cruelty of a seasoned assassin, but the way she said it, as if observing a particularly pathetic stray dog. And then came the slap. Not a furious, uncontrolled blow, but a sharp, stinging smack that landed on my cheek with the definitive thud of finality. It was a punctuation mark to her assessment of my life, a physical manifestation of her contempt. I stood there, the sting on my skin a dull throb beneath the sudden, icy shock. My normal, the carefully constructed equilibrium of my life, fractured in that single moment. I lived a quiet life. I worked hard, I paid my bills, I tried to be decent. My sister, however, seemed to operate in a different stratosphere, one where judgment was her native tongue and condescension her daily bread. She always had a way of making me feel small, insignificant, like a shadow in the grand tapestry of her perceived success. But today, that shadow had been physically struck. It wasn't the first time she'd belittled me. Her pronouncements on my career choices, my romantic entanglements, even my taste in books, were delivered with an unwavering certainty that brooked no argument. I remembered years ago, after I'd inherited a modest sum from our aunt, enough to be comfortable, to ease some of the financial anxieties that had always clung to me like damp clothes, she'd spend an entire Sunday afternoon meticulously itemizing every cent. She'd spread the bank statements across our parents' dining table, her finger tracing each number. "You're just throwing it away," she'd sighed, a theatrical puff of air. "A more sensible person would have invested it wisely." "But then, you've never been sensible, have you?" I'd swallowed the retort, the familiar lump forming in my throat. Sensible, in her eyes, meant accumulating more and more, hoarding it like a dragon on its treasure. I just wanted a little breathing room. Later, when I'd mentioned a down payment on a small apartment, the one I now lived in, she'd scoffed. Rent-controlled? How quaint. Then there was the time our father was ill. He'd always been generous, a man who believed in sharing what he had. He'd helped me out with a few things, always with the understanding that I'd pay him back, which I always did, with interest. My sister, on the other hand, had a different approach. She'd been the primary caregiver, a role she performed with a martyr's flair. But beneath the surface of dutiful care, there was a calculation. She'd made it clear, in hushed tones to our mother, that she expected compensation. "It's not like I have a lot of savings," she'd confided, her voice dripping with faux hardship. "And my time is valuable." When he eventually passed, she'd presented a detailed invoice of her expenses, from petrol to time spent holding his hand. The inheritance was divided, and while I received my fair share, she'd managed to secure a disproportionate amount, citing her sacrifices. I'd stayed silent, watching her tally the figures, a cold knot forming in my stomach. The incident itself was deceptively simple. We were going through some old boxes, clearing out the attic of our childhood home after Mom had moved into assisted living. It was a dusty, melancholic task, filled with forgotten treasures and the ghosts of memories. My sister, Amelia, had been particularly focused on important documents, things she deemed valuable. I, on the other hand, was sifting through old journals, faded photographs, and my mother's surprisingly extensive collection of poetry. Amelia had always been territorial about our parents' possessions, especially anything that had monetary value. She'd made it abundantly clear that anything she deemed significant was hers by divine right. I was sorting through a stack of my old school papers, childhood drawings, and early attempts at creative writing, a sentimental hoard I'd kept tucked away for years. Amelia, with a huff, shoved a large, canvas-bound portfolio towards me. "You can have this junk," she'd said, her voice tight with impatience. "Just get it out of the way." I'd opened it, a wave of nostalgia washing over me. It was filled with my early manuscripts, stories I'd poured my heart into as a teenager, poems I'd scribbled in the margins of textbooks. There were also legal-sounding documents, contracts related to a small business I'd once considered starting, detailed financial projections I'd meticulously crafted, and research notes I'd gathered. It was the genesis of my current career, the foundations of my financial stability, everything I'd built from scratch. I'd always kept these raw materials separate, a testament to my journey. As I admired the sheer volume of work, Amelia, who had moved on to rummaging through a trunk of our mother's jewelry, let out a dismissive laugh. "Honestly, look at you," she'd said, turning around, her eyes sweeping over my collection of papers. "Still playing with your little stories. You're practically destitute." And then, without warning, she'd strode over, her face a mask of disdain, and slapped me. The sharp sting, the cold shock, the utter humiliation. She then snatched the portfolio from my hands, her eyes scanning the contents with a sudden, predatory gleam. "These look like important documents," she'd stated, her tone shifting from contempt to a calculating interest. "Are these financial? Business plans?" Before I could even process the slap, the shift in her demeanor, she'd tucked the portfolio under her arm. "You know what," she'd continued, a smug smile playing on her lips, "since you're so, I'll take these. They'll look much better with someone who knows how to use them." And with that, she'd walked out of the attic, leaving me stunned, the ringing in my ears a testament to her aggression, the ache on my cheek a physical manifestation of her contempt. She'd taken not just papers, but years of my work, my foundation, my future, all under the guise of charity for my perceived poverty. The silence that followed her departure was deafening, broken only by the frantic thumping of my own heart. The sting on my cheek began to fade, replaced by a cold, seething anger. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just stood there, the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light, and I thought. I replayed her words, her actions, the smug satisfaction on her face as she'd walked away with my portfolio. The poor slur, the slap, the blatant theft, it wasn't just about the papers. It was about her need to dominate, to belittle, to take what wasn't hers. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I couldn't let this stand. Not because I was weak, but because she had underestimated me profoundly. I walked out of the attic, not in pursuit of her, but towards my own space. I didn't call her. I didn't text. I didn't inform any of our family members who might be swayed by her dramatic retelling of the degenerate gesture. Instead, I went to my study. The room was meticulously organized, a testament to the very principles of planning and execution that Amelia so readily dismissed. I opened a secure digital vault, a system I'd put in place years ago, safeguarding the digital backups of all my important documents, including those that had been in the physical portfolio. I knew she wouldn't be able to access them. They were encrypted with multi-factor authentication, requiring not just passwords but also unique biometric scans that only I possessed. Then, I remembered something else. Buried deep within the legal clauses of our parents' will, a detail I'd meticulously reviewed and understood, was a provision regarding the distribution of personal effects and tangible assets. It stipulated that any items deemed personal creative works or business development materials were to be considered the sole property of the creator, irrespective of where they were found after the primary estate settlement. I'd made sure of that. The next morning, I received a frantic text from Amelia. "Where are my documents? You stole them from me." I didn't reply immediately. I let the silence stretch, knowing she would be spiraling, constructing her narrative of victimhood. A few hours later, I received a call from our mother. "Darling, Amelia says you took her papers. She's very upset. She said she was just trying to help you, and you've stolen them." My mother's voice was weary, laced with the familiar anxiety of sibling conflict. "Mom," I said, my voice calm and even, "Amelia took my portfolio. The one from the attic. It contained my early manuscripts, business plans, and financial projections. I kept them as records of my journey." There was a pause. "But she said she was helping you because you're, well, you know." "She slapped me, Mom. And then she took my work, saying I was too poor to keep it. That's not help. That's theft." "Oh, dear." Later that day, I received another text, this time from Amelia's husband. He was usually quiet, a placid man who tended to echo Amelia's sentiments. "You need to return what you took from Amelia. She's very distressed. She has our future to think about." I finally responded. Not to Amelia directly, but to her husband and our mother. I attached a scanned copy of the relevant clause from our parents' will. Then, I sent Amelia an email. It was brief and to the point. Subject: regarding your possession of my property. Amelia. You are in possession of property that belongs solely to me, my personal manuscripts, business plans, and financial projections, stored within the Canvas portfolio. As per the stipulations of our parents' will, these items are my intellectual and creative property. I require their immediate return. I have secured digital backups of all these documents. However, the original physical copies are irreplaceable. If they are not returned to me within 48 hours, I will be forced to pursue legal action for theft and misappropriation of intellectual property. This would involve not only the recovery of my portfolio but also potential damages for the emotional distress and inconvenience caused. I have also forwarded a copy of this email and the relevant will clause to our legal counsel. Sincerely. The fallout was immediate and, for Amelia, catastrophic. Her frantic texts escalated into desperate pleas, then angry accusations. She tried to spin it to our extended family as me being a petty thief, jealous of her generosity. But the legal language, the mention of intellectual property, and the cold, factual presentation of the will clause were undeniable. Her usual flying monkeys, the relatives who always sided with her loudest pronouncements, found themselves on shaky ground. They couldn't argue with a legal document and a clear threat of litigation. Amelia's husband, who had ambitions of his own and a healthy fear of legal entanglements, quickly distanced himself from her increasingly frantic denials. He'd seen the will clause, had probably advised her to tread carefully. The pressure mounted. She couldn't afford legal fees, not with her own precarious finances that she so often bemoaned. The idea of her being sued for theft, of her character being publicly dissected in a court of law, was a prospect that clearly terrified her. Within the allotted 48 hours, Amelia, with a palpable air of defeat and simmering rage, left my portfolio on my doorstep. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of her actions. Just the silent, heavy weight of the portfolio, a stark reminder of her failed attempt at dominance. She had, in her arrogance, assumed I was too weak to fight back, too much of a pushover to defend myself. She'd underestimated the quiet strength that comes from years of silent endurance, from meticulously building something real from nothing. The subsequent weeks were a study in her unraveling. Her frantic calls dwindled. Her social media posts, once filled with carefully curated displays of her supposed success, became erratic and defensive. The whispers started. Not about my actions, but about hers. The incident had exposed her true nature to a wider circle, the entitlement, the greed, the petty cruelty. She'd slapped me, called me poor, and tried to steal my future, and in doing so, she had, inadvertently, revealed her own profound destitution, not of wealth, but of character. The social consequences, the quiet ostracization from circles she'd once dominated with her sharp tongue, were her own making. She was left to face the quiet fallout of her own making, a homelessness of reputation she'd created for herself. I never mentioned the slap again. It had served its purpose. It had been the catalyst, the final, stinging push that propelled me from passive acceptance to decisive action. My life continued, quietly, steadily, built on foundations she had tried, and failed, to steal.